The Rocky Mountains Forest Reserve is a tract of land owned by the Government of Canadian Province of Alberta, called Crown Land, along the eastern slopes and foothills of the Albertan section of the Canadian Rockies. It is a long strip of land just east of the more famous Canadian Rocky Mountain Parks, which is managed for industrial and economic goals, rather than aesthetic and conservation goals as in the parks. Dennis, the Chief Inspector of Surveys for Department of the Interior, wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Department, stating that the permanency of our water supply is largely dependent upon the preservation of the forests at present covering the watershed, and this protection can only be secured by prohibiting the cutting of the timber. Surveyor William Pierce was an early and influential advocate of preserving the region, and convinced the government to set aside a large part of the region from the agricultural settlement occurring elsewhere in the Canadian West. The Rocky Mountains Forest Reserve was first created in 1910 by the Federal Government of Canada by Privy Council Order No. 939 to protect the headwaters of the rivers which supply most of the Canadian prairies with fresh water. Since its inception, the area has always been managed to allow industrial activity, particularly logging and mining, with much less importance placed on recreational or conservation uses, in contrast to the neighboring national parks. Nevertheless, water has been a recurring theme, with the protection of the headwaters always being the stated priority of government agencies. The size and shape of the reserve changed repeatedly and dramatically in its early years. In its original configuration in 1910, the forest reserve constituted two disconnected pieces of land, neither of which are part of the modern reserve. The more northerly part was north of Jasper National Park, today the Wilmore Wilderness, and the southerly section was between Jasper Park and Rocky Mountain Park, today the northern third of Banff National Park. In 1911, Jasper and Rocky Mountain Parks were reduced in size and the land transferred to the Rocky Mountains Forest Reserve. In 1917, Rocky Mountain Park and Indiana 1927, Jasper Park were greatly expanded at the expense of the reserve. In 1929 and 1930, the park boundaries were adjusted slightly, giving the Kananaskis Valley back to the reserve. With the passage of the Albertan Natural Resources Act, 1930, management of the parks and reserve became separated. American Samoa. All public lands, outside of national parks and military bases, in Alberta were transferred from the federal to the provincial government, including the reserve. In 1948, the province designated all of its forested lands the Green Area, including the eastern slopes. The provincial government did not enact legislation to formalize its management of the region as a forest reserve until the Forest Reserves Act of 1964, which provides for the maintenance of water supply and the conservation of forests and other vegetation. Since the provincial government acquired the reserve, its area has slowly been reduced as other land use regimes have been established in various smaller parcels of the land, such as the Wilmore Wilderness Park established 1950s, the three strict wilderness areas, Ghost River, Seafloor, and White Goat, established in the 1960s, the Kananaskis Country Park system established in the 1970s, and the numerous small parks and recreation areas along the David Thompson Corridor established over several decades.